2 months ago, we did a handful of videos where we discussed each of the heroes' categories, as well as the categories for each of the roles within Marvel Rivals, and a lot of you really liked it. Season 2 is right around the corner, and I've also been given early access to the new patch, so I have a bit of a finger on the pulse as to what this next season's going to look like, and I love helping people, so today I'm going to revisit this. The first thing we're going to talk about is the 4 categories of tanks, and then we're going to go into each of the specific tanks and talk about them, point by point, as well as discuss counters so that when you encounter one of these categories, you can switch to a tank that can help you best deal with them. Category number 1 is a category that is tried and true. These are your anchor tanks. These are tanks that gain their tanking through powerful barriers and shields. These are characters that use some form of external health thing to keep them alive, typically something that can be shot through as well. And one of the things that we did in the last time we did these videos, the last time we did a tank categorization video or a hero categorization video in general, is we talked about the ults, but I also want to start taking a lens and look at the abilities that some of these heroes and their categories offer as well. For example, the anchor tanks, as we've studied them, focus heavily on utility as their main ability. It's like a Dr. Seuss book in here right now. These characters tend to have things that aren't necessarily like leaned towards one thing. They're just meant to be a multi-tool, which is why anchor tanks, as well as another tank category we're going to discuss a little bit, are what we describe as main tanks. They're the type of tanks that almost every team would be good to have. You need at least one main tank in most team compositions to be successful. They have medium damage, good range, great range, the best range of all the tanks, but not the greatest in mobility. They're rather slow, which means that when they get into space, they want to hold that space by not necessarily being aggressive or offensive, just simply controlling space generically. Their ults also are something that we focused on last time that we're going to focus on here. All of the anchor tanks ults in some capacity focus on immediate damage negation, some type of shutdown tool that allows their team to stay alive for even longer. The next type of tank category are the Brawl tanks, and Brawl tanks, as well as the next category we're coming up against with is dive tanks, are both off tanks. In other words, these are tanks that aren't designed to be the sole heart of your team without some serious building. Like, you really need to lean in to a Brawl tank's strengths and weaknesses if you really want to have these tanks be your only tanks in the game. Not to say it can't happen, but it's just a little bit more challenging. It's a little bit more difficult. These tanks are tanks that gain their sustain through overhealth, typically. Something that gives them a bit more longevity while they're still absorbing health or absorbing damage directly. Their abilities focus typically on disruption. One of the things that we have seen as more heroes are getting added is that this Brawl tank category is heavily focusing on things like stuns or knockback or something of the sort, which of course, when we get into the specific heroes, I think will make a lot more sense. Brawl tanks have really good damage, but they also don't have a lot of range. Brawl tanks also have pretty good mobility. In fact, I see a lot of commentators confuse tanks that are pretty much pure Brawl tanks as dive tanks, which all tanks, or all characters for that matter, should be looking for opportunistic fights. They should be looking for ways to find and seclude, like, let's say, a support or a target that's off on their own, using what mobility tools that they have. But I think we can all agree that the Thing is a much different type of dive into their backline and try to find a kill than, say, Venom. But of course, we'll get there. Their ults tend to focus on damage, with a secondary effect being stun and displacement. In fact, the vast majority of tanks you're going to see in the Brawl category list when we get there are tanks that have basically high damage first off their ult, and anything that follows that tends to be some sort of, like displacement, knockback, etc., and as well as a stun. The next category of tanks is another off category of tanks called the dive tanks. These are tanks that are great at diving backlines, as the name implies, but they're also an off tank. They're not as good at controlling space and keeping their team alive as like the anchor tanks would, and they get their tanking via burst shielding, some type of typically longer cooldown or something that has to be triggered on and off type of shielding that allows them to, when it's necessary, it's sort of a skill check for them, is to turn off that damage. They don't have the greatest of damage overall. They have rather low damage, but they have an okay amount of range in order to keep this up. All of them have amazing mobility, the highest mobility in the tank category in the entire game, better than a lot of even DPSs and supports. They also have abilities that focus on invasion and escape, which kind of just leans further into what they are as a dive tank. All of their ults as well focus on sustain, something that keeps them alive and allows them to continue to do their job of harassing the backlines. The next type of tank that we're going to look at here are the bunker tanks. This is a new category of tanks, something that we discussed in previous videos, but we are making official in here. These are tanks that receive their tanking via placed objects and threats. These tanks' abilities focus heavily on burst damage. While, let's say, the Brawl tanks are good at damage, the abilities of bunker tanks are much more eliminate a squishy target right away. All of their abilities tend to push towards that direction. And these tanks seem to have a pretty even split. Medium damage, medium range, medium mobility, all just sort of okay. They're all right at everything, which does make them an okay choice as a main tank. You are going to start seeing, especially as Marvel Rivals begins to add more heroes and more tanks into the game, that bunker tanks can work as a main tank. They're not as easy to play in that main tank category, but they absolutely can work. All of their ults focus on damage setups. All right, good, excellent. Let's move on to the per hero basis. The first hero we're going to talk about, all of these are in alphabetical order, by the way, so if you want to skip through, feel free to do so. The very first tank we're going to talk about is Captain America. I've had a lot of people discuss whether Captain America should have at least some area of Brawl in him, but I actually had a bit of a brain blast about Captain America. I was thinking, man, Captain America feels weird. Like, he's a dive tank, sure, but there's something else about him that makes him feel not entirely like a dive tank. What the heck is it? And then I started thinking, I think Captain America is 80% dive, 20% anchor, which is why it feels so weird. His shield operates almost identically to one of the other anchor tanks. It's just small and weird, but it's a shield, right? His ult is also different than, say, like Venom, who uses his ult as both a form of getting some damage and quick burst damage in, as well as sustaining himself. Captain America both sustains himself and allies around, which is exactly the same sort of formula that an anchor tank would have, some way of mitigating damage to the rest of his team. I think Captain America is a freaking anchor and a dive tank at the same time. That's really cool. But I have something else I want to add, as something new to add towards our understanding of how these tanks work. We're going to look at their offensive scale. What this offensive scale is meant to help describe to players like yourself is when you generally should be using these heroes. This is something that you can help inform your decision making. Again, this is not a hard prescription for how this works, but just generally how the hero tends to lean, like where their strengths tend to lean. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 3 being effectively neutral, where does Captain America reside? Captain America, I believe, is a 4 here, meaning that he prefers to be on offense more than anything else. Next is Doctor Strange. Previously, we had him at 100% anchor tank, with an argument to be made for him being like a true multi-class tank. I think it's more accurate to say that Doctor Strange, especially with the latest nerfs, is more of an anchor tank 80% and a Brawl tank 20%. Offensively, he is scaled at, kind of sits towards the neutral, so that puts him at a 3, meaning that, yes, he does want to be offensive, but he can also do defense just fine. With the patches that came through, like I mentioned, he has lower damage, and player understanding, like how to make Doctor Strange work, has raised him up to near the top of the meta, again, due to his intense damage potential, due to his intense damage output, which is why we moved him more, at least a little bit, into the Brawl tank category, even though he is mostly anchor tank by a wide margin. Next is the new hero, Emma Frost. Emma Frost, we spent a lot of time discussing, especially over here on Twitch, which, if you'd like to get more content from us and support us in any way, we have a Twitch and we have a Patreon. Both of those will be in the description for you. But anyway, Emma Frost, as I was playing her, became very clear to me that she's not the anchor tank we thought she was going to be. While yes, she does have a barrier that can be shot through, which is pretty indicative of an anchor tank, I think it's more accurate to say that she is 50-50 bunker and Brawl. Her multi-mode swap allows her to swap between those two playstyles on the fly, and she has an intense amount of survivability that comes from placing objects such as her shield, as well as her burst damage, which comes from her psionic spear, making her more of a bunker tank than an anchor tank, again, despite the shield. And of course, when she's in her diamond form, it is the most purest example of Brawl that we can see. She has stuns, amazing damage, and all of that built into disruption, and her ult acts like a bit of both. It's both a disruption thing as well as something that's meant to set up other forms of damage. It itself is just all right for damage. It's pretty easy to escape once players have realized what's happening. This places Emma as well in the offensive scale of a 4, so which means that she generally wants to be on the offense. Next up is Groot, who hasn't really moved a whole lot. We still have Groot in the 80-20, 80 bunker, 20 brawl, and he has an offensive scale, as most bunker tanks typically will, as a 2. He's more defensively minded. He wants to have enemies come to him rather than he going to enemies. Again, no major changes other than just players understand how to play him better, which has gotten him frequently banned in Grandmaster and up lobbies. But again, to him, no major changes. The Hulk is interesting. He is now 80-20 dive brawl. Previously, we had him at a split 50-50, but I think it's pretty safe to say, based off of how slow the Hulk's damage is, with that little bit of range that he has, as well as the increase to his movement speed and his more uptime for his shield, moves him more into the dive tank than he was prior. Still absolutely has some of those brawl tank abilities and such, but again, much more focused into getting into the enemy's backline where he'll find more of his success, and he, like most dive tanks, are more offensively minded, placing him at a 4. Next is Magneto, and again, not a lot has changed for Magneto other than his ult charge is now a little bit slower, and he lost his team up with Scarlet Witch, but he is 100% an anchor with an offensive scale of 3, meaning that he's pretty neutral. He's totally fine either on offense or on defense. He does not care. Next is Penny, who is 100% bunker. Hopefully to no one's surprise, although I do think that we will see a bunker tank that's more bunker than Penny eventually, but for right now, she's our purest example of it, and as a pure bunker tank, she has a low offensive scale of 1, although I'm sure the Cringe Alarm fans will disagree with me. She generally wants, by default for most players, she's going to want enemies to come to her rather than her to them. She gained increased crit damage and faster movement while shooting, which again, I believe further cemented her as a bunker style tank. Next is the Thing, one of the new characters since we have done this video last time, and the Thing is 100% Brawl. This also places him in the offensive scale of 4, meaning that he generally wants to be aggressive and end people's face, but it doesn't mean that he's incompetent at being defensive. And the only thing that really changed from him from when he first released until now is he has reduced damage resistance from his Embattled Leap ability. But again, this dude is all hands, and he is the 100% pure haymaker brawl type of tank. Thor is an extremely offensive, so an offensive scale of 5 brawl tank, a 100% brawl tank. And I think this does a better job of describing, because again, I've had people say that maybe Thor should be a little bit of dive, and I think just looking at it on the terms of an offensive scale might help better describe what he is, because I do believe that Thor is a pure brawl tank that just happens to be extremely offensive, even more so than the Thing. And his base health is increased to help match and to basically even out his lost anchor with previous season. So this places him comfortably in this brawl category. Again, you can let me know if you disagree in the comments below, of course, after you subscribe. But here's a funny graph. Definitely a lot of you should, because a lot of you watch without subscribing. Anyway, Venom. Venom is 100% dive. Previously, we had him placed at the 80-20 mark, but as the game has progressed and as players have begun to understand him better, myself included, I think it's easier to say that Venom is a pure dive tank rather than a dive that has a little bit of brawl. I think it's just cleaner to say it this way. I think previously it would have been more accurate to say 90-10, but again, I try to keep my scales between 20-80, 50-50, or 80-20, or 100. So Venom, 100%, with an extremely high offensive scale of 5. He always wants to be in the backline. Despite his ult being focused on damage, it's very clear that this ult's one of its best purposes is to be used as a form of him surviving, of him staying alive, getting the massive bonus over health, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's all of the tanks academically. I now want to discuss honorary tanks, and this is something that we did last time, starting off with Mr. Fantastic. Mr. Fantastic is 100% a Brawl tank, something that we haven't changed since our last assessment of him, and offensively, he's pretty neutral. I think most DPSs are going to be either offensively neutral or offensively forward, and so we have him at a 3 here. And again, he's an honorary tank, and the patches gave him a lot better damage overall, as well as increased health, which I think even more cements him as a sort of tank in a way. And his abilities now also cause a slow, and his ult now gives him overshield, which again, further cements him as basically being a tank with slightly less overall health. And lastly, for another honorary tank, one that I felt like should have probably been in here, because he definitely plays like it sometimes, especially if you've got a really good one, and that is Wolverine. Previously, we had the Wolverine as 100% Brawl, but I think it's better and more accurate to say that Wolverine is 80% Brawl, 20% dive. He tends to be much more focused on getting in and getting the backline, but not the backline of the supports, the backline of the tanks. He's trying to get behind the tanks so that he can easily hijack them and throw them into the rest of the team for kills, which, at least in flavor, is a lot similar to how a dive tank would operate, as well as obviously brawling for the vast majority of his time. This places him an offensive scale of 5, and like I said, he's an honorary tank, and the patches have moved around his rage and where he gains it, granting him generally more rage for non-ability usage, just generally taking damage and swinging with his claws. So what do we do with this information? Well, let's first start by talking about counters. The counters for each of these tanks have been expanded to help you guys out even more. First off, with the anchor tanks are excellent at countering bunkers for DPS, sustain, and for supports, lifelines. Their long-standing shields and increased range allows them to comfortably duel with things that are trying to do things that are similar to them, but aren't quite as good, of which bunkers, sustains, and lifelines tend to fit into this category. The anchors are countered by Brawl tanks. The Brawl tanks also counter flanker DPSs and playmaker style support. So basically, anything that comes to them, they are more than happy to deal with. Again, think about how much of a bad matchup things like a Spider-Man is against a thing. Next, for the dives, the dive tanks, I went back and forth on this a lot, but I don't think the dive tanks actually counter anything or are countered by anything, at least for the tanks specifically. Being that tank's whole job is to control space, and being that dive is trying to invade other enemies' space, I think this just means that they're a skill check more than anything else, because we can pick out an example from each of the categories that do an okay job of countering, say, a Venom. But the dives themselves also do an excellent job of countering DPSs for pokes and supports utilities. Basically, anything that has low mobility that tries to focus in on long range, dive tanks do, of course, an excellent job of shutting them down. And lastly, the bunker tanks. The bunker tanks are excellent tank-wise against Brawl, DPS against Brawl, and supports, just kind of neutral to all of them. They just sort of trade neutrally with a lot of the supports. A lot of the supports don't generally want to interact, nor do they need to interact with bunkers. But of course, anything that comes to them, similar to how the Brawl tanks work, they are more than happy to deal with, but they need their things to stay up and active. So the Brawl tanks who lack range, and the DPSs that also lack range, is an excellent tool for them to shut down. So with this, hopefully you can get an understanding of when you need to swap. Of course, take this all with a grain of salt. You obviously need to understand what it is your team is doing, what it is that the enemy team is doing, and make an intelligent decision for yourself. But hopefully when you're out looking at the rest of the team, you're looking at your team, you're looking at what the enemy team has, you can get an understanding of what it is you need, what it is your team is lacking, or what it is the enemy team would likely be weak to. If you can make intelligent swaps, even if you're just okay at those characters, it can be an absolute game changer. I really hope this helps you guys out win more games. I hope it lets you have more fun within Marvel Rivals. Thank you guys so much for the continued support. Subscribe, leave a like, and a comment below. Bless your faces, and deuces.